Have you ever been to a birthday party and saw someone singing happy birthday, the person was blowing out the candles on their cake, or even been to a wedding where the bride and groom are cutting the cake for the first time? Do you stop and think, why? Why are there candles on a cake? Where did this tradition come from? How did cakes become the center of many of our celebrations? Well, cakes have actually been being eaten for hundreds of years. Not many people know where they came from or how they have evolved through the years to be what they are today. It wasn't until the late 19th century, in the Victorian era, when people had cultural curiosity to look into the origins of cake. And because it did take them so long to figure out where this came from, there are many theories because there are no solid facts. One theory is that it started in ancient Rome, when they would take sweetbread and break it over the heads of the newly married couple. Many believe that sweetbread at the time was an early form of cake. Another theory comes from the Oxford English Dictionary, tracing the word cake back to the 13th century in medieval times. In the medieval times, they would use fruit cake and gingerbread so it would preserve for several months and be able to feed several people at feasts and things like that. Another theory is that it dated clear back to the Neolithic period. Archaeologists believe that they have found traces in chemical analysis showing oats and honey being used in a form of cooking, and they believe that this was the early stages of cake. When cake was first created, it was used on hot stones. They didn't have ovens and traditional ways of baking back then. They would actually take the ingredients and pile them onto a hot stone and wait for it to bake. Later, cakes were made with tin hoops or wooden hoops or even paper hoops. And this was used to form the cake a little bit better. The first form of icing actually came about when they would boil the finest sugars, flavorings, and egg whites, pour it onto a cake, put it back in the oven, and then when they pulled it out, it would harden right away and look like ice. And that's where ice first originated. The first ingredients that were used in cake were very hard to come by in the times. Cake was very expensive and it was only for the wealthy. Not everyone could access the expensive materials. If one could not afford cake, then he himself would avail for the poor man's cake. This was said by Marie Antoinette. This is the origins of let them eat cake. It came from a flour and water paste that was stuck to tin hoops and to the insides of the oven and would be scraped out at the end of the night by a baker and left outside for the beggars. Marie Antoinette, by saying, let them eat cake, was actually insulting the poor people who could not afford to make cakes. She believed that because the people who were poor were uneducated, they would not get the joke. Let them eat cake was actually a very rude thing to say. Not everybody could afford cake, but they did what they could to get by. In early times, they would actually have sweet rolls. It is said that in medieval times, couples would pile sweet rolls in between a bride and groom, really tall, and the bride and groom would have to kiss over it without knocking any of the rolls over. A French baker witnessed this and went back to his bakery, and he then made his own version of a multi-level sweet concoction, and they believe this is the actual beginnings of wedding cakes. In 1888, sugar flowers were used for the first time. This was allowing them to put decor, such as flowers and leaves and things like that, on a cake while remaining edible. Later on, we actually started using what is called fondant. It is a dough that is edible that you can use to cover a cake to create a stiff, dense material so that it can hold up to all of the decor that is put on the cake and yet remain edible. In 1950, figures were being put on the cakes for the first time. You would often see bride and grooms on top of cakes, and this was done most in the U.S. Over time, this has changed, and today, in present times, bride and grooms aren't always on cakes. Sometimes you'll see monograms or other such things. there's been an evolution even in the toppers that go on cakes. In the U.S., you will see many people celebrating with the cutting of the cake at the reception at the wedding. In the UK, they will have a wedding breakfast where cake is served the following day. Cakes were often fruit cakes in individual boxes in the UK found at royal weddings, and this made it so it was easy to distribute to the guests as opposed to cutting and serving the cakes. Another popularized birthday cake is the birthday cake. Birthday cakes were believed to originate in the 15th century in Germany. They often would make a single one-level cake and distribute it to those who were wealthy on their birthdays. In New Zealand, they would start singing Happy Birthday, and at the end of the song, they would clap for every year the person was born, and one clap for a year of good luck. In Uruguay, Happy Birthday to You was sung, and then everybody would gather and touch the shoulders and head of their birthday person. In Ecuador, the person whose birthday it was would take a big bite out of the cake and then serve it to their guests. Swedish birthday cakes are often found to have the country's flag on the top of them. In Russia, they actually make a birthday pie where they will carve a birthday greeting into the crust of the pie. Birthday cakes are used all over the world. In 1799, there is a letter from a German resident that stated that they carried a beautiful torch with colorful flaming candles for the prince's birthday. This is the first documentation we have of candles being placed on a cake, so we believe it originated in Germany. The thing that they would do is they would put a single candle in the middle of the cake, and this symbolized the light of life. Candles very quickly took off. In the U.S., you see them on cakes to represent the number of years of the person's birthday. The Greeks would often use candles because they wanted their cakes to glow like the moon, and they would carry the cakes to Artemis's temple, the goddess of the moon. Others believe that when you blew out your candles, the smoke would carry your wishes to the heaven skies. A lot of people believe as they close their eyes and blow out their candle, they make a silent wish for their futures. Candles are very, very, very traditional. In 1851, there is actual documentation that was found in the beginning of one of our cookbooks of a young girl whose birthday, out on the Pioneer, and she wanted a cake. You could not make cakes at the time the traditional ways. They would actually grind corn with a hand mill, little bits at a time, and put it aside until they had enough to use. Then they would use a half a cup of wild honey, 1 wild turkey egg, 1 teaspoon of homemade soda, 1 scant cupful of sour milk, and a small amount of butter in a skillet over an open flame in their yard. And this is how they made a birthday cake for one pioneer girl in 1851. Cakes began to take off with the Industrial Revolution, along with many other things. The cake supplies were more readily available, the tools were coming in bulk, and it was then made so that not only the wealthy could have cakes. Cakes became available to even the common man. In 1947, Betty Crocker created what we know as the first cake mixes in a box. These actually did not take off at first. People did not want to accept it. They believed that it was too easy. And after World War II, everybody wanted to return back to the things that they wanted mom's homemade cooking and the comforts of home. They did not take off or accepted. After time, cakes did catch on, and today, box mixes are now considered homemade because you make them at home, and scratch cakes are becoming very scarce. In 1949 in Denver, they tried to solve the problem with cooking cakes at different altitudes, and they actually created a high-pressure chamber that would go up to 7,000 feet without hitting the ground. This was done by Pillsbury to solve the problem of cakes collapsing at high altitudes. After 200 flights and 64 cakes that were successfully created, they were able to adjust the box's instructions so that you could make cakes at a high altitude. Today, cakes come in many different ways. You have cupcakes, cake pops, and so many different things. But not a lot of people know how we got there. Lots and lots of people are curious to know where cakes came from. And with the beginnings from the ancient Romans, the Industrial Revolution, to the beautiful tiered cakes we see at weddings today, that is how they